Hello! We're up to number 4 now. Now, novice, this one's organized a little bit differently than what you're used to. But hey, that happens. There is no rule that says you have to organize it this, and this. As long as you have the stock issues covered, you meet the rule of prima facie. So, with that in mind, just flow it the best you can, and then, in a real round, you would get up and say, hey, what's this? What's your harms? Where's it at? Where's the card? What's your inherency? And you just ask for clarification during cross-ex. And that's a big reason why we have cross-ex, is so that you can ask for clarification. So, do the best you can. Here we go. Observations. 1. Americans have a fundamental right to travel. Wrangle 13. In accordance with Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to travel freely is a fundamental human right. For nearly half a century, our citizens have been denied this right when it involved travel to Cuba. While current policy allows family members of Cuban nationals to travel there, most Americans are outright banned from traveling to Cuba. Not for study, not for tourism, and not even for charity. Observation 2. The Cuban embargo bans travel to Cuba for most Americans. Haney 11. Obama's changes essentially returned these rules to where they were before Bush's tightening in June of 2004. Obama will also allow U.S. telecommunication firms to start to provide services to Cubans. Not much else has changed, however, as the rest of the embargo has so far gone untouched by the Obama administration or the U.S. Congress. The travel ban for U.S. citizens remains in place. While there are some circumstances under which Americans can get a license to go to Cuba, most Americans continue to be prohibited from going to the island. Therefore, we offer the following plan. The United States federal government will substantially increase its economic engagement toward Cuba by lifting the ban on travel to Cuba. Specifically, notwithstanding any other provision of federal law, the President shall be prohibited from imposing restrictions on travel to Cuba that are more restrictive than those that apply to any other international destination. This plan offers the following advantages. Advantage 1. Lifting the travel ban advances freedom for Americans. A. The travel ban unreasonably restricts freedom of travel. 1. The travel ban is hypocritical in that it restricts freedom at the very time we accuse Cuba of doing the same. Seaman 10. One does not need to point out the hypocritical nature of the U.S. government in debunking the Cuban regime for quelling the rights of Cuban citizens, while at the same time impinging on the liberties of United States citizens by preventing them the freedom to travel where they please. 2. The travel ban subjects Americans to unreasonable legal peril. TAMO 12. The new regulations also require that a representative of the licensee company each tour. Some of the agency award licenses last spring were barely legal storefronts created by enterprises already in the Cuban travel business, according to licensees. 2 paragraphs added to the regulations also reinforce the message that tourism trips are illegal and punishable by a fine of as much as $65,000. B. Lifting the travel ban best ensures freedom to travel. From Mead 13. I would like to see the embargo abolished completely. Short of that, I believe that all Americans have a constitutional right to travel to Cuba, and I think the travel ban is exactly the kind of big government assertion of power that civil libertarians should fight. Advantage 2. Lifting the travel ban advances freedom for the Cuban people. A. The travel ban allows a repressive government to control its people. Number 1. The educational purposes provision serves to prevent tourists from coming in contact with normal Cubans. TAMO 12. The U.S. Treasury Department has tightened a few of its restrictions on trips to Cuba by 9 Cuban Americans on so-called people-to-people visits, saying the revisions will help to deter abuses. Complaints of abuses of such trips, they must be for educational purposes, never for tourism, have dogged the program since President Barack Obama approved it last year in a bid to increase Americans' engagement with regular Cubans. Number 2, the family travel limitation disadvantages racial minorities in Cuba. Wickman 11. The travel ban, its supporters have long argued, is necessary to keep dollars out of the coffers of the Castro regime. That's laughable, given the exception made for Cuban Americans. But what the ban effectively has done is reward the families of the white Cubans who disproportionately immigrate to the United States, while punishing the families of the black Cubans who have largely remained in Cuba. Without American relatives to send the money, black families suffer most from the Cubans' economic problems. Number 3, the family travel limitation violates the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Valdez 13. The guidelines to be implemented by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the United States Treasury Department, do not allow non-Cuban ancestry Americans to travel to the island, something that was permissible before June 6, 2004. The new ruling has serious and profound legal consequences. The new rules violate the equal protection under the law that is supposedly secured for all Americans. In other words, advantageous and preferential treatment is provided to a set of people of a particular national origin, Cubans. This unusual type of discriminatory advantage, based solely on national origin and national ancestry, is one in which the majority of the American population is discriminated while a minority is benefited. In other words, a different standard on the right to travel to Cuba is used for Cuban ancestry persons and the rest of the population. One enjoys the right to travel, the majority is denied the same right. B. Lifting the travel ban best promotes a transition to freedom in Cuba. Number 1. Tourist contract offers voices of freedom that the Cuban regime could not control. Perez 10. The stories visitors bring with them from the U.S. and the rest of the world hold more credibility than the radio signals sent in from southern Florida. This is a form of communication that the regime cannot control, since the messages brought by family members are not easily spun in the government's favor. In this way, increased people-to-people flows thus add to the pressures for change in Cuba. Even when weighed against the drawbacks of increased travel to Cuba, namely increasing the amount of hard currency available to the government, the benefits of a policy that eases the travel ban still justify its implementation. And 2. Tourist contact will best promote a democratic transition in Cuba. Goodfellow 11. 2 years after the travel restrictions were ended, Cuban shops and cafes would be jammed with Cuban and American young people exchanging email addresses and ideas. And an end to the embargo would allow entrepreneurial Americans to flood the island with cheap cell phones, personal computers, and internet service. These might initially be restricted by the government, but as we have seen in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, consumerism is hard to stifle. Ending the embargo and allowing Americans to travel to Cuba would not guarantee an end to the Castro regime in the span of 2 years, but the seeds of its destruction would have been sown as a million Alan Grosses fan out across the island. Moreover, the Castro brothers would not be able to blame all the regime's shortcomings on the embargo imposed by the imperialists to the north. Young Cubans would know exactly who has kept them in poverty and in the information dark ages, and they would have acquired the tools to do something about it. I'm now open for cross-examination and points of clarification.